Great. Thank you very much, Tumi, and thanks everybody for joining us this morning. And as Tumi mentioned, the topic of my presentation is the greatest risks that the world is facing today. A look at sustainability, and I believe only in 15 minutes, so wish me all the luck in the world as I tried to compress such a complex topic into a short space of time. But what an exciting time it is to be alive. The rate of technological advancement and innovation is running at its hottest pace since our Homo sapien cousins first emerged, what it was all those 200,000 odd years ago. Scientists believe that we have exited the Holocene, which we have been in for the last 12,000 years since the previous ice age, and are now officially in the Anthropocene, where humans and human-led behavior is having the single greatest impact on the planet's climate and ecosystems. Let me repeat that. Humans and human-led behavior is having the single greatest impact on the planet's climate and ecosystems. But many believe that this technological advancement and innovation that we are seeing today will be the panacea or the solution to all our current woes. And maybe the opportunist, the optimist in me at least, believes that we can even reverse some of this damage that we have done in the course of the last 200 years or so. So there she is, our planet, our only planet, Mother Earth. I caught up with some of my wealth colleagues a couple of weeks ago in the wake of Sir Richard Branson and Jeff Bezos as they catapulted or launched themselves out into the cosmos. And when they returned from space, the overwhelming sense you got from them is that we have one planet and we need to take care of her. So Elon Musk is aiming for Mars. Jeff Bezos is a little bit more tempered in his ambitions, and he's only aiming for the moon. And when he came back from his experience outside of the atmosphere, he spoke of moving some of our high-intensity, carbon-rich, or at least carbon-intense production and manufacturing onto the surface of the moon. But of course, this is really big sky thinking. But during the course of today, I'd like to take you through some of the big sustainability themes playing out. And importantly, what are the current technologies and the technologies that are just around the corner where the research is being done today and investors can gain access to that. And I think importantly, participate and be active in the green evolution and transition that we are seeing. So this is the global population over the course of the last 300 years. We hit our first billion people in just after 1804, in fact. My grandmother, rest in peace, was born in 1919, and then the world wasn't even 2 billion people. Today, some of her great-grandchildren that are being born into a world where the population is almost 8 billion. I believe we had about 7.6 or 7.7 today. So 4 times the amount of people on planet Earth than when my grandmother was born that century or so ago. I think what's important to take from this chart as well is the exponential growth and how for every billion people that are being added, the time frame is being condensed somewhat. So I'm going to test my maths here, very brave in the public eye, but I think it took about, 123 years to go from 1 to 2 billion. From there, it was only about 33 years to reach the 3rd billion. Then about 14 billion years, I think you get the picture, to get into the next billion. And then it's projected about 2024, in 3 years' time, we will officially reach 8 billion. And many forecast that we'll break the 9 billion barrier and maybe go a little bit north of 9 billion as we get closer to 2050 and then peter out from there. I think many of us are very well aware of the aging populations that we're seeing in the like of Europe, Japan, maybe less so in North America. Even China have foregone their one-child policy in favor of a 3-child policy recently. So governments are becoming increasingly concerned with what an aging population means. Another interesting field that we're seeing in the research space is around human migration. Obviously in the news recently, a lot of that is around geopolitical risks. But what we are seeing is in certain parts of the world is people moving as a result of resource scarcity, lack of arable land, rising temperatures, increasing potential for drought, and most importantly, the most precious resource of them all, water, and more specifically, water risks. So I think it's worthy to define what sustainable development is. I think we hear this term being bandied around a fair amount. So this was taken from the Brundtland Report as commissioned by the United Nations, that sustainable development is the development that meets the needs of the present generation without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So within that lies a real notion of stewardship. We want to leave a world that is safe for our children and grandchildren to thrive in. I think it was the UNICEF forecast that about 1 billion children are highly or extremely exposed to climate-related risks. I think it's worthy to mention that the climate crisis is not just an environmental one, but therefore most definitely a human one as well. And then I'm going to steal a quote before I move to my next slide from one of the guests we had on our last Responsible Investment webinar, who said that in order to be, you cannot be a sustainable company if you're operating in an unsustainable society. And we, as we grow and start to reach that 9 billion people, I think we're putting incredible amount of pressure on our limited resources. So Tumi mentioned the World Economic Forum Risk Framework. This is a snapshot of the framework and how it has moved and evolved from 2019 to 2020. So you can see some of the changes. These are perceived risks. The most notable one, of course, is the shift in infectious disease. And I think we all agree that the likelihood is highly likely that this is now taking place, has moved towards an upward location. I think it's also worthy to mention this is the most highest risks. So this is the top right quadrant. There are those further down and further to the left as well. So focusing on these major risks, we can see the infectious disease, weapons of mass destruction, interstate conflict, which may have changed in the wake of what we saw in Afghanistan recently. And then also slightly noticeable is the lowering of perceived risk around some of these environmental factors, which occupied the top 5 risks in 2019. And I think this is almost like a zero-sum game in favor of the infectious disease from a risk perspective, but doesn't discount their importance. And because of something like this, there are many that, as we move into the United Nations Framework Convention or the COP26 meeting in Glasgow in November this year, is that a lot of nations, in terms of their focus, as well as their budgetary focus, has been shifted maybe away from battling the climate crisis more into their healthcare systems, as well as kickstarting their economies post-COVID. So Code Red for Humanity, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which feeds into the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change at these COP meetings, have been running some reports in terms of climate change and human-made influence on climate change over the course of the last 30 years or so. And I'm going to take you through how this rhetoric has evolved over the course of time as science has become more cemented. So human activities are increasing greenhouse gas concentrations, and that rising concentration would result in greater warming of the Earth's surface. That was in 1990. In 1995, the balance of evidence suggests a discernible human influence on the global climate. Then 6 years later, in 2001, there is new and stronger evidence that most of the warming observed over the last 50 years is attributable to human activities. 6 years later, in 2007, most of the observed increase in global average temperatures since the mid-20th century is very likely due to the observed increase in anthropogenic greenhouse gas concentrations. Then in 2013, it is extremely likely that human influence has been the dominant cause of the observed warming since the mid-20th century. And then much media attention. Last month, they released their 2021 report, which has been mentioned as the Code Red for Humanity, that it is unequivocal that human influence has warmed the atmosphere, ocean, and land. So scientists are becoming increasingly convinced that we are in the Anthropocene and humans are having the greatest impact on the planet's climate and ecosystems, on land and in sea. Nerds will invent the future. I absolutely love this quote. I think it was Vinod Cosley who said this, venture capitalist. I think there is no cooler time to be a nerd than today. He was speaking about 10 years ago. I think it was one of these Ivy League graduation ceremonies, trying to get these graduates who would typically focus on things like producing apps or working for Apple to move into the climate tech space because he saw incredible opportunity there. I think if you look at patents, and I have this in the slide coming up, you'll see that this is a lead indicator in terms of where some of the technologies are going. He was trying to encourage people to get into the likes of climate science, energy storage, battery storage, and very importantly, 24-hour around-the-clock renewable energy. Even the nerds in the investment industry have been getting to work recently. I was reading a report or an article from Morningstar that in the first quarter of this year, climate-related investment funds or strategies have attracted, or at least are 6 of the 10th largest funds in terms of inflows in the first quarter in Europe this year, to the tune of about 100 billion euros. So we look for lead indicators to what might say, where is the technology going? So if we rewind to the turn of the century and look at patent filings and deployment of wind energy technology globally, you'll see this kind of peaked in sort of 2006 and 2007, and wind technology has really taken off. In South Africa's last Renewable Energy Independent Power Producer Program, or the REAP, I think wind came in at about 64 cents a kilowatt hour, by far the cheapest. Solar was at about 78 cents per kilowatt hour. The International Energy Agency have highlighted that patents around new green technology are far outpacing any other technology for that matter, including fossil fuels. I was reading a report by The Economist recently as well to say that they forecast the fastest growing job in the US over the next decade as we move towards 2030 is, believe it or not, a wind turbine technician. And the third fastest is a solar panel engineer. So the indications are there in terms of where we're going from an energy perspective. On the right there is sector penetration and total patent score, information technology, greenhouse gas reduction, energy supply, all the way down to production, photovoltaic, which is your SPVs or your solar panels, health and hydro. And the idea is to identify companies that are providing solutions to the climate crisis. So the green economy, again, follow the money. This is global venture capital deal into climate technology. As we see, even in 2021 so far is the third highest year, and we're only halfway through the year. US energy storage systems, capacity installed per year, I might as well not have included those first 10 years, but 2021 has most definitely been a moving year, just in terms of installed capacity around energy storage. And then last but not least, this slide I pieced together late one evening. I think it might have even been Sunday night. We've been running our responsible investment review here at Neg Group Investments, looking at 47 managers from around the world and what they're doing in terms of responsible investing. And one of the questions we asked them was to highlight their top 3 climate-related risks. And I think I managed to bring all the data together. I got over 200 different fields or sectors they were looking at. I tried to condense that further. I think I got it down to 150, and I think here might be about 40 or so sort of subheaders that I managed to piece together in terms of what fund managers are focusing on with regards to sustainability and more specifically the climate-related risks. So the overwhelming response there are those in the bigger text, which is carbon regulation and pricing. As you know, our Minister from the Department of Environmental Affairs, Mr. Creasy, goes to Glasgow in November. She will go with the idea of committing South Africa to certain emission reduction targets, and that feeds into national policy and regulation and carbon taxation. So this is something fund managers locally and internationally have highlighted. So carbon tax, regulation, carbon trading schemes, emissions related on the top left there. So some of the environmental ones in green, extreme meteorological events, global warming and temperature rises, water security. I was quite surprised how little we saw water security mentioned. Insurance industry risk, which is related very much to the physical risks of climate change. And there in small text, you can see sea level rises. And I think it's incredibly impactful for the insurance sector. Commodity opportunity. And we heard Nikki Weimar talk yesterday about maybe South African investors don't necessarily can get domestic exposure to some of this new technology that's being developed around the world, but via our commodities and resources such as nickel, copper, the PGMs, your palladium, rhodium, for example, we're able to gain access to some of this exciting technology and participate in their investment movement there. And then in terms of the energy transition, so South Africa, we have a long way to go in managing our just transition. There's a social element to a lot of these environmental developments as well. I think our wind and solar is currently about 2 gigawatts each, so cumulatively 4 gigawatts of our total national capacity of 50 gigawatts, which puts it at about 8%. And Cyril Ramaphosa and them have obviously come out with some wonderful initiatives to really try kickstart again and get that renewable energy program started. And then in the bottom right, just last but not least, we have electric vehicles and the electric automation industry as a whole, for that matter, not just vehicles, but locomotive as well. Joe Biden recently came out requesting from Congress $50 billion to build the infrastructure around electric vehicle charging stations. I think he went to Congress with 50 billion. They then started talking about 12, and he got about 7 billion signed off in the end. But hopefully these are positive developments that we're going to see take shape around the world, as the likes of the US who are targeting, I think it is 50% of all new vehicles by 2030 to be electric. So that's the optimist in me anyway, and hopefully South Africa, we have a lot of room to move, but can go down a similar road at some point, and I'd like to end it on that note. Thank you very much, Timmy.
Thank you so much, David. I just want to latch onto that last point that you made. You were talking about, South Africa, where we sit, and of course, you've been talking about global trends. So, if the South African government have to come to you and say, David, maybe give us some advice on what we could do from a policy perspective, can you maybe just share some light, a high level, on what we could do specifically with regards to energy and mining?
Yeah, sure. I need to sort of self-reflect and realize I'm quite environmentally empathetic. So I need to understand the social element. I make more space for that in my thinking as well, because we speak about a just transition as we move from a carbon-intensive energy production, which employs so many people in South Africa, to one of more the greener technologies and the renewables. So there's that side of it. I think the investment industry is looking for a lot of clarity from government around some of the policy. During the Zuma years, I think if you looked at our chart in terms of capacity and renewables, I've spoken about solar and wind, for example, it really flattened out for about a 4-year period. People were losing jobs here in Cape Town, those working in the renewable space. A bit of clarity in terms of where the renewable energy program might go as we start heading into window 5 effectively. So yeah, that would probably be the main intervention we can have. I think if we look at Eskom, our scope 1 emissions, essentially, when reporting comes around, as Eskom is about 50% of our national emissions. So when we go into Glasgow, our national emissions sit, I think, rule of thumb, about 500 million tons. Eskom is about 250 million of that. So if we want to have a real material intervention, this is why we speak so much about the energy sector.
David, thank you so much for your time. Really interesting insights there. Certainly does make one sit up and listen. Thank you so much. Obviously, that was David Levinson. He is an investment analyst at Net Group Investments. And of course, he was taking us through those particular trends that we're seeing in this space.